We're glad you could join us as we continue our studies in the book of Micah. Hope you'll take out your Bible and follow along as we continue in Micah chapters 4 and 5 today. We have emphasized in our studies that Micah was a prophet in the northern kingdom during the period of the divided kingdom, when the northern kingdoms had separated from the southern kingdom, Israel compared to Judah. Micah was during that period, but he was primarily a prophet to the southern tribes of Judah, although he did at sometimes prophesy regarding the north. The theme that we have emphasized in our study is that God is making an accusation as on a trial. He's a witness against the nations of Israel and Judah because of their sins. The first couple of chapters, God gave his testimony about the people's sins and the punishment that would come as a result. The section that we're in now, he's specifically rebuking the leaders, discussing the consequences of their conduct. In the last couple of chapters, we'll see where God compares his treatment of the people to their treatment of him. Where we are in chapters 4 and 5 right now are a description of the conditions that the people in Israel, and particularly the southern tribes, would face because of enemies. Contrasted, though, to the future blessings that would come in the New Testament under the Messiah. Now, it may seem difficult at times to understand that and to distinguish when he's talking about Micah's day and when he's talking about the future with regard to the time of the Messiah. However, as we have discussed in previous studies, we have New Testament passages that help us to make distinctions between the two. We also, though, have some clues in Micah's chapter 4 and 5 that I believe will help us. So let's look at some points that might help us. First of all, as we studied the chapter 4 of Micah, the first 8 verses, there were a number of things that showed that he was talking about the future. Chapter 1 talked about, it shall come to pass in the latter days. So that's something in the future. It shall happen. Latter days. And then it proceeded to discuss how the Lord's house would be established, shall be established in the future. And then verses 4 and 5 talks about how the people shall be without fear. There would be peace and so on. Then verses 6 through 8, God said, in that day, then the same period of time, you see, I will make a remnant, and the Lord will reign over them. So again, it's in the future, in that day, the latter days, when the Lord's house would be established. So all of those things, it seems clear to me, are referring to the future fulfilled, as we had discussed in the New Testament, in the establishment of the church, beginning on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, and the reign of the Messiah in his kingdom, which is the church. Those things have been fulfilled beginning in the New Testament in Acts chapter 2. But now, as we continued in chapter 4 of Micah, notice Micah goes back to talk about some things in the present, that is, in his day. He said in chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, now, notice that word now, in contrast to the latter days, but now, that is in Micah's day, it talks about how that there would be pain like a woman in labor, describing the suffering of the people when the enemies, specifically when Assyria, would attack. And later on, Babylon would attack. Now, verse 11 through 13, we're going to see this today, continue talking about now, many nations gathered against you. And then chapter 5, now he has laid siege against us, and so on. So there continues to be, it seems to me, a section there talking about the suffering in Micah's day, when the Assyrians attacked the northern tribes, took them into captivity, destroyed the nation of Israel in the north, then continued on into Judah, captured many of the cities of Judah, but failed to capture Jerusalem because God delivered the city of Jerusalem because of the faithfulness of the people. Now then, in chapter 5, he continues, and we'll see then, having moved on, he once again goes back to prophecy of the future. We will see in chapter 5 and verse 2, out of Bethlehem shall come a ruler, referring to the Messiah. Again, something in the future. It shall come, and then a remnant shall return, going back to the concept of the remnant and the future, and he shall feed his flock, he shall deliver, that is, the Messiah, the ruler that would come, would feed his flock, deliver them from the Assyrian. And we'll see the Assyrian there is symbolic of their enemies. The remnant would be among the peoples. In that day I will remove sorcery and idolatry, as the chapter concludes. So it seems to me that we have a section talking of prophecy of the future, the New Testament, the gospel age. Then Micah returns to his time, describing the suffering that they would endure because of their enemies, Assyria and Babylon, then back once again to prophecies of the future. So let's continue then as we conclude chapter 4 and see how this fits. But that doesn't mean that we got the answer, that I have the answers to all the questions, because there's some difficulties in some of the language. But I hope this helps. It helps me to understand those things as we begin. So let's go back now to chapter 4 and the first 3 verses, reviewing the prophecy of the beginning of the Lord's house, the church in the latter days. We talked about how the latter days were the gospel age. Many nations, that is, Jews and Gentiles, would all flow into this Lord's house because the word of the Lord would go forth from Jerusalem. So the Lord's house would be established. But then we talked about in our last lesson how those who'd been driven away, God would gather them together, and they would become a remnant. We emphasize the idea that a remnant is just a part of some larger thing, something larger. And there would be then a part of the people. God's people have always been a remnant. We discussed that. Always a part of those who are in the world are faithful, never the universal, all people saved, as some people would have us to believe. Jesus said that the few would be on the narrow road to life, Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. That's the remnant in the New Testament. God's people serving him in the New Testament. And then it talked about how that, nevertheless, back now to the Old Testament, not the remnant now, but back to the Micah, those people would go into Babylon, but they would be rescued from there. That's the section that we're in, verses 9 and 10, as we concluded our study last time, which brings us to verses 11 through 13. So let's go ahead and read chapter 4, verses 11 through 13, and then we'll discuss it somewhere. Now also many nations have gathered against you. Notice the word now. Now also many nations have gathered against you, who say, let her be defiled. Let our eye look upon Zion. But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord, nor do they understand his counsel. He will gather them like sheaves to the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron, and I will make your hoofs bronze. You shall beat in pieces many peoples. I will consecrate their grain to the Lord, and their substance to the Lord of the whole earth. Now again, we have some symbolic language, but notice he's continuing to talk about now, not the future, not the latter days when the church would begin, but in Micah's day. As in verses 9 and 10, now they would be in pain, and some would actually go into Babylonian captivity, but now, verses 11 and 12, many nations have gathered against you, not the future, but the present time, people seeking to defile Zion. That is, they hope to capture the nation. Now, when the Assyrians came, if we go back to Isaiah chapter 37 and other places as well, in the books of Kings, it records how that the Assyrians took the northern nation of Israel into captivity, destroyed the nation so that it never was built again as a nation. They continued on into Judah, the southern tribes, and captured many of the cities. Tried to capture Jerusalem, but failed because King Hezekiah prayed to God and was faithful, trusting in God. And so, as a result, they were not able to take the city. And so, as it says in verse 12, they did not know the thoughts of the Lord. They did not understand his counsel. So, they thought, the Assyrians, the Rabshakeh, and as a representative of the king of Assyria, they thought they could easily take Jerusalem because they had taken so many other cities, but they didn't know God's plan. God's plan was to protect and defend his people. And so the passage then says that he would gather them like sheaves at the threshing floor. And the people would arise, he says, and thresh and make them as though they are the grain being threshed. And again, it's an illustration. But the significance of threshing in that day, when the grain would be brought in from the harvest, it would be placed on the threshing floor, and they would have animals walk on the grain to separate the wheat, the kernels that was good grain, from the chaff, which was then blown away with the wind and removed. So all would be left would be the grain. But the animals that would walk on that then would be treading on it with their feet. But God is using that illustration about the nations that wanted to attack his people under the Old Testament. We're still back under the Old Testament now, the time of Noah. Now these things will happen, he says in verse 11. And so the idea is that Assyria wanted to attack and capture, but God had a different plan. And God's plan made them like the sheaves on the threshing floor. But as the animals that would walk on them had hooves of bronze and iron. Again, symbolism. Animals don't really have those kind of hooves, but the point is that it would be a very crushing defeat to Assyria. And they would have to then leave. And remember the account then. God sent an angel, and 185,000 of the soldiers of the Assyrians were slain by God, without the people of Judah even having to fight. So those were the things that happened in Micah's day, when Assyria attacked, and that would be the end result. So now, as we continue into chapter 5, excuse me, he continues to say, and we'll read verse 1, "Now gather yourself in troops, O daughter of troops. He has laid siege against us. They will strike the judge of Israel with a rod on the cheek." And so I believe the significance here is that it would continue to be an attack. And again, now, notice the word now, Micah's day, not the future and the coming rather of Jesus and the beginning of the church, but Micah's day, he said, "Gather yourself in troop," that is, the people of Israel and Judah were to prepare for the attack. It was coming. Get ready. The siege is coming. And they will strike the judge of Israel with a rod on the cheek. The judge in those days would be spoken of as a king, would be a ruler or a judge. And so it seems the symbolism of striking on the cheek with a rod would mean that even the king of Israel would be taken. And that's what happened. Israel was taken captive and the nation destroyed. But they could not take the king of Judah, Hezekiah, because God protected him. So that seems to me, and I realize that this is a difficult section, at least it is for me, but it seems to me that the point here is in the last part of chapter 4 and into chapter 5, verse 1, which really, remember the chapter divisions were added by people later on. They're not actually a part of the inspired scriptures. And so chapter 5, verse 1 continues the point of chapter 4, if we understand that. So looking back over chapter 4 and into chapter 5, prophecy of the gospel and the New Testament age, the beginning of God's kingdom, the church. Then a section going back to the suffering of the people in Micah's day, in contrast to the future blessings. In Micah's day, they were going to suffer at the hand of their enemies, but in the end, the enemy, Assyria in particular, would be defeated. Now then, it's going to go back to the future again. Prophets often do that. Speak of the future, speak of the present, speak of the future, and so forth. He's going to talk more now about the future. So let's continue as we look at chapter 5, and in particular verse 2. He says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting." So now we have a prophecy which having read it in Micah's day, might not be a sure understanding of what it means, but we have now the blessing of the New Testament, which helps us understand. Bethlehem was a small village south of Jerusalem, not at all a place where you would expect a great ruler to come from, and yet the passage says that out of Bethlehem would come one who would be the ruler of God's people, a ruler in Israel. Now, how do we know what this means? Who is this ruler? If you go to the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 6, you have the story of the birth of Jesus. And you remember that when the wise men were coming to visit Jesus because they'd been led by the star, they went to the King Herod and asked where the ruler would be, where they could find him, the one who would be born. And so Herod called in the leaders of the Jewish people and asked them where the Messiah would be born, and they quoted this passage, Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, that out of Bethlehem would come the ruler. So while I'm not completely sure how those Jewish leaders knew that this passage was prophesying the Messiah, they did understand that, and they were right about it. He was born in Bethlehem. And so they understood the passage to mean that the Messiah was the ruler who would come to be born in Bethlehem. So we have the New Testament to help us then to understand this passage. The ruler would be born in Bethlehem. And that's exactly what was the proper application of the passage. And so we have this prophecy fulfilled in Jesus Christ, just one of the many, many prophecies that Jesus fulfilled, that he would be born in Bethlehem. Now, it's interesting that this is prophesied, interesting in several ways. In the first place, the passage says it was just a small city, small town. You wouldn't expect the great king to be born in such an insignificant place, but it was important and interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that Bethlehem was the hometown, you might say, of David, King David of the Old Testament. The Messiah, the Christ, was prophesied to be a descendant of David. God had promised to him that his descendants would rule, and ultimately that the Christ was going to come as a descendant of David. And that's why he was born in Bethlehem, the hometown of David. But interesting also is the fact that Jesus' mother, Mary, and her husband, Joseph, did not live in Bethlehem. They lived many, many miles away to the north in Nazareth. So while Jesus lived with Mary, and I was born rather to Mary and Joseph, who lived in Nazareth, the prophecy said the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. It might seem then that that wouldn't happen. There wouldn't be Jesus to fulfill it. But in fact, he did fulfill it because, as you recall the story in Matthew, that they were called to Bethlehem for purposes of taxation. And so while they were in Bethlehem, Jesus was born. So Jesus did fulfill the prophecy of being born in Bethlehem exactly as Micah had predicted many hundreds of years before. Now there's another important point then to make from this passage, and that is it says that this ruler, the one to be the ruler in Israel, his goings forth were from of old, from everlasting. In other words, he did not come into existence when he was born, but he existed from everlasting. He is eternal. Now that's not true of ordinary people. All of us, you and me, we came into existence when we were conceived in our mother's womb and then born, but we didn't have previous existence, certainly not everlasting existence in the past, but Jesus did. Jesus was his birth as born of a virgin to Mary, without the action of a man, as described again in Matthew chapter 1 and also Luke chapter 1, was the Son of God because he was eternal. He always had existed, but he came to earth in the flesh as a man because as God he couldn't die. So he became a man and the flesh so he could die on the cross for our sins. And so there are many other scriptures that talk about the fact that Jesus was eternal. Even though he was born as a man, he had already existed from eternity. John chapter 1. And the first 3 verses there talk about how that he was in the beginning with God. And all things were made through him. So he was the creator. He could not have been created if everything was made by him. He could not himself have been created. He didn't make himself. So he was the creator who made everything that was made. Therefore, he was eternal, in the beginning with the Father. In Revelation 22 and verse 13, he referred to himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And all those expressions are terms for God, deity, and they all emphasize eternal existence. Always had existed, always will exist. In John 8 and verse 58, he called himself the I am. He said, you must believe, even before Abraham was born, I am, he said. So he is eternal in the past. That name I am is a name for God, used to refer to God in Exodus chapter 3, where God describes himself to Moses as the I am. Tell the people, he said, the I am has sent you. So all of these passages, and many others we could talk about, describe Jesus as being, in fact, eternal. And this is prophesied here in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, fulfilled in Jesus when he was born in Bethlehem, exactly as the passage says, born to the Virgin Mary. Well, let's continue then, looking at some more of the passage. When he's born, what would happen? Born now in Bethlehem, but listen now, verse 3, and we'll read down through verse 6. Therefore he shall give them up until the time that she who is in labor has given birth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel. He shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. They shall abide, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. This one shall be peace. When the Assyrian comes into our land, and when he treads in our palaces, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princely men. They shall waste with the sword the land of Syria, and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. Thus he shall deliver us from the Assyrian, when he comes into our land, and when he treads within our borders. Now again, we have some highly symbolic expressions, not always easy to understand, certainly not for me. And yet, I believe it's helpful to compare what I believe Micah is doing, conditions in his day and the problems they were facing with the Assyrians who were attacking, compared to the future when the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Notice some things it says would happen as a result of the Messiah. It says that he would give them peace. Verse 3, he would give them up until the time that she who is in labor has given birth. What is referring to, the she who is in labor? Well, think back to chapter 4, verses 9 through 11 of Micah. That's the expression that was used for the people suffering in Micah's day. They were suffering painfully like a woman in labor. But when the Messiah comes, he will give peace to those people who'd been suffering. They had suffered at the hands of the Assyrians, and later at the hands of the Babylon people, of Chaldeans of Babylon. And so that she who is given in labor, then it says, then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel. There's the remnant again. Remember, we already saw in chapter 4, the first part of that chapter 4, the remnant refers to God's people under the New Testament, the church. They are the remnant, those chosen from among the people of the world to be God's people. That's the remnant. So Micah is tying together the problems of his day to the future blessings under the gospel. Whereas the people in his day were suffering at the hands of the Assyrians like a woman in childbirth, this one who shall come, the one who would be born the ruler in verse 2, he would, in verse 4, stand and feed his flock. The remnant of his remnant, his brethren, his people, would return to the children of Israel, and he would stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord. Okay, so again, it's symbolic. Jesus was not a literal shepherd, but you remember John chapter 10, He described himself as the Good Shepherd, who would not only provide for his people and guide his people like a shepherd would, but he would even give his life for the sheep, he said. So Jesus was like a shepherd to the people in fulfillment of the prophecy, having been born in Bethlehem, that he would take those people, and again, many generations later, not immediately after they suffered at the hands of the Assyrians, but many generations later, this would be fulfilled. In the strength of the Lord, he would stand and feed them. In the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, they shall abide, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. And this one shall be peace, he says in verse 5. Okay, so he's going to bring peace. Now, what kind of peace? Well, remember we talked back in chapter 4, verses 3 and through verse 5 and 6, that the peace that he's talking about is spiritual. He isn't saying here that their enemies would be physically destroyed under the New Testament, physically defeated. He isn't saying that this would be that all the nations, as some people want us to think, that all the nations on the earth are somehow under the Messiah going to have peace with no war between nations. That isn't the point. He's talking about spiritual peace, as we discussed back in chapter 4. Peace between, first of all, the people and God, because their sins are forgiven. And this then would lead to peace between Jews and Gentiles. All those who would accept the gospel would become united in Christ, Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 and following. And they would have unity, peace in the church under the leadership of Christ. Now, many people, most people, in fact, won't accept the gospel because this is talking about the remnant. Just the few, the faithful few on the road to the narrow road to life, Matthew chapter 7, they would be the ones who would accept the teachings of this ruler, and the ones who would then have the peace that he had to offer, the ones who would follow their shepherd. And so then he would lead them, it says, in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name of the Lord, and he would be great to the ends of the earth. Then it talks about the Assyrian again coming into the land. Verse 5 continues. Now, in Micah's day, the Assyrian literally was coming into the land. But if I have this understood, if I understand this properly now he's using it symbolically. The suffering at the hands of the Assyrians in Micah's day is a symbol of the enemies of God's people under the New Testament. It's symbolic language. I know he's still talking about the future because it's still future tense. He shall stand and feed them. And he will raise up against him. And they shall waste, verse 6, with the sword and so on. So these are future things here. Again, talking about, I believe, continuing the description of the Christ, the Messiah, the things that he would do. Being born in verse 2, here's what he would do. So this is the future. But Micah is using the suffering of the people at the hands of the Assyrians as a symbol of the enemies of God's people. Throughout the many years of the existence of the northern nation of Israel, the Assyrians were their enemies. And they suffered at the hands of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians eventually destroyed the nation, took them into captivity. And so they become symbolic, just like the Bible often uses Noah's flood as a symbol of evil, people being evil and being punished by God, and Sodom and Gomorrah. Those are real events. But after those events, they're used symbolically of later events and the evils of various other nations and peoples and so forth. I believe that's what God is doing here. Assyria attacking the people in Israel and then later Judah in Micah's day, he is being used here as a symbol of the enemies of God's people under the Messiah. And I know he's still talking about the Messiah because it's still future tense, because the context, that's what it seems to me to be. So when the Assyrian comes into our land, future tense now, and treads in our palaces, we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princely men. Let's come back to that in just a minute. They shall waste with the sword the land of Assyria and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. He shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and when he treads within our borders. Still talking about the Messiah. He will deliver his people from their enemies, the Assyrians. Now, several things we might type some loose ends here. Nimrod, who is Nimrod? Well, if you go back into Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 11, you remember that Nimrod was the one who began the city of Nineveh, which was the capital city of Assyria. So it's just an expression, as the prophets often did, identifying a land by referring to people that were important in that land and cities that were important and so on. So Assyria, the land of Nimrod, would be defeated. Just as God defeated them literally when they tried to attack Jerusalem in the time of Hezekiah, God defeated them, 185,000 died. In the same way, as a symbol of the New Testament, in the days of Christ, his people would be victorious. They would suffer at the hands of other people, but in the end, God's people, led by the Messiah, the Christ, will be victorious. We will be the ones who will ultimately receive God's favor, his eternal blessings of eternal life, and those who oppose the gospel will be defeated. Well, okay, and then what about the 7 shepherds and the 8 princely men? Well, that's a strange expression. And if we try to take that literally, try to say, okay, we got 7 of these men as shepherds, and we got 15 or whatever. That isn't the point. It's symbolic language. It's language like, for example, in Proverbs chapter 6, when Solomon says, there are 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. 6, that is 7. It's a way of emphasizing a point. That doesn't mean it's the only things that are the abomination of the Lord. Those are just the ones he wanted to emphasize. Later on, in Proverbs chapter 30, it talks about 4 things. And a number of times he describes various items he wants to talk about. Amos chapter 1, we discussed, he said for 3 and yes for 4. So there's 7, that is 8 is just a way of emphasizing. 7 is a number, a complete number. And even beyond that, so God would have, I don't think it's talking about a particular individuals, but God would have the leaders that his people needed so that his people could be faithful and stand firm, even though they would have enemies that oppose them. The enemies would be defeated. Now that approach helps me as I approach the passage. I understand that there are things here that I may not have a complete grasp of, but I hope those thoughts are helpful to you as you continue your study of the book of Micah. And Lord willing, next time then we'll begin in verse 7 as we continue our study. Thank you.